Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Alicia Odewale. I'm an African diaspora archaeologist by training. I'm also an adjunct assistant professor at Rice University, the executive director for Archaeology Rewritten. It's a archaeological and educational consulting firm, and I'm also the director of the Black Heritage Tree Project and the co-director of the Mapping Greenwood, also known as Mapping Historical Trauma in Tulsa project. But I'm so grateful to be invited to the land justice, the first ever land justice convening in Atlanta, hosted by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I'm just happy to be here virtually speaking with you on this pre recorded lecture. But I am so excited to be part of this work that you all are doing together. The title of my presentation today is called Let the Rocks, Trees, and Soil Cry Out, Reclaiming Our Land and History with What We Have Left. And I am going to be sharing with you for the next 45 minutes or so. And I do have slides, so I'm going to go off screen now and start sharing my slides. So just to give you a few disclosures about me and my work, I am affiliated with Rice University, as I mentioned, and that is a private, predominantly white institution and an R1 doctoral granting institution. I'm also the founder of Archaeology Rewritten and both the Mapping Greenwood and Black Heritage Tree Project. Both of these works are funded through the National Geographic Society that support my role as a National Geographic Explorer. And all of the educational and community-based resources that I'm going to be sharing with you today have been co-created. So even though I'm speaking as an individual right now, I represent a team of at least 23 people on the Black Heritage Tree Project. And that doesn't even include all of these students, the fieldwork students that have been part of our work, the project collaborators, all the community support that we've gotten, and support within National Geographic itself, from the education department to the EduLab team, and especially archaeology in the community who serve as our fiduciary sponsors throughout both of those projects. So I really, really thank all the people who've come together to make these projects work. So to give you a bit more about my positionality and my background in this, I do identify as a Black woman, woman of African descent, but I am American born. So I was born and raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the United States, but I hold Nigerian kinship through marriage and motherhood, since I'm raising two children who consider themselves to be Nigerian. I am ancestrally connected to Black descendant communities based in Tulsa, aka Greenwood, which we're going to hear a lot about today, the historic Greenwood District, Langston, Oklahoma, Tuskegee, Alabama, to Cleveland, Tennessee, and several Black communities in the Maryland, Virginia region. But I'm also a descendant of both freeborn and enslaved peoples, Black and white passing, enslaved and enslavers, war veterans, farmers, entrepreneurs, the list goes on, but the tree is wide. And on that tree, I'm proud to have survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, but I do not consider myself to be a direct descendant of those survivors because, man, like I said, we have a large tree of hundreds of people on it. But those do include some distant branches with survivors from Tulsa. And I'm also fueled by a passion to use archaeology as a tool to help Black descendant communities around the world heal from systemic anti-Black violence, erasure, and historical trauma. So that is really my centralizing mission, my North Star, why I do this work, is to use everything that I'm doing now as a tool to empower Black communities around the world to reclaim history, reclaim land, reclaim space, and be in the driver's seat of their own story. So, the big goal that I'm working on now in my work is building a restorative justice archaeology model. And my goal with this is that I definitely want to use archaeology as a tool to do this work, but it needs to be something that when you're building out this model and you're working with a lot of different Black descendant communities in different areas around the country, they all have different needs, they all have different goals that they're working towards, and they all have different histories. And within these spaces, we want to build out a model that can be applied anywhere, but it's flexible enough that can meet those needs. So that means building out something so that no matter what that community is working with, what tools, what resources, what uh, things they still have in their environment to use to tell their story, no matter what they have left. If they've got structures, if they have archives, if they have people with living memory who are still living in the area, there's lots of things that we can use as remembrance work. But so in some cases, they don't have any of that. We still want to build out a model to help them tell their stories and reclaim their heritage, whatever that looks like. So the big questions around this are number one, how do we reclaim our land and our history if we have nothing left that we can use as evidence of our existence in a space? And two, what are all the tools we can use to support restorative justice and reclamation efforts from Black descendant communities around the world? Part of a case study in what restorative justice archaeology looks like. And I am going to read to you, this is a trigger warning. I'm going to read to you a survivor testimony because I believe the first voices in this multivocal soup that we're making should actually be from the survivors themselves and not me. So I'm going to express that we all do a moment of silence through this. And while I'm reading, take some time to meditate, to breathe, to think through what it is you're hearing in this survivor testimony and what images come to mind for you. One of the most horrible scenes of race hatred and mob violence that history has ever recorded on the face of the globe occurred at Tulsa, Oklahoma on the night of Tuesday, May 31st, and morning of Wednesday, June 1st, 1921. All night long, they could be heard firing from both sides as the whites gathered more than 5,000 men to make an early attack on the Negro section in the morning. At the signal of the whistle, more than a dozen airplanes went up and began to drop turpentine balls upon the Negro residences, while the 5,000 whites with machine guns and other deadly weapons began firing in all directions. Negro men, women, and children were killed in great numbers as they ran, trying to flee to safety. Several were tied to the backs of automobiles and dragged through the streets, while bullets were being fired into their bodies. As the fighting progressed, men were captured and taken to the town hall. Women and children were taken to different parts of the city. After they had cleared more than 500 homes, then the dirty work of firing and looting of homes began. Torchlights were used with gasoline to burn up the Negro settlement, and in the meantime, they used large trucks loading up pianos, victrolas, dishes, furs, and other articles that were in the Negro homes. Greenwood Street, the Negroes' Broadway of Tulsa, and one of the best Negro business streets in the whole USA, now lies a heap of ashes. The number of whites and Negroes killed in this raid will never be known. Reverend Augustus Hicks, pastor of the AME Church in Sand Springs, as cited in Mary Jones Parrish book, Events of a Tulsa Disaster. And this book was published in 1923. This was the first publication of chronicling of any eyewitness testimony from the Tulsa Race Massacre. And Mrs. Mary Jones Parrish put all of this together. Excuse me. Now, after hearing that, for most people, as they hear a testimony like Reverend Augustus Hicks, they see these images of buildings on fire. And that's common because this is the most utilized part of the collections that are left of the Tulsa Race Massacre, of Greenwood's really overall history. The most used photograph, the most cited, the most circulated photograph from those collections is the one I'm showing you in the center here that has etched onto it, running the Negro out of Tulsa, June 1st, 1921. And what most people don't realize is that the photos that are in these archives, they are not neutral. Archives are not neutral spaces. Archives can be incredibly violent spaces, even if you don't understand what you're looking at. And for these photos, the one in the center that I'm showing you is actually a set of 16 photos that were taken during the Tulsa Race Massacre, but then turned into postcards. And those postcards were mailed across the country to further terrorize Black communities. And those 16 postcards showed not just buildings on fire, but people burned, laying in the street. And they were turned into basically lynching trophies and recruitment materials for the KKK. So these images that we see in the archives, they are further perpetuating trauma. So I'm only showing this as an example, and to really share the context of where a lot of these images are coming from. But I don't use images like this in my classroom. I try not to perpetuate the trauma that this photo was intended to try to pull out. So it's the last time you'll see a photo like this from me. But I do want to talk about what the most common images we have in our mind of Tulsa are. And what's really interesting is that when we talk about the destruction, there were over 1,000 homes that were destroyed, close to 200 businesses that were destroyed, and this doesn't even capture all the businesses that existed in Tulsa and Greenwood in 1921. That's just the ones that were destroyed, but there's also many more that existed outside of that, because this doesn't account for the boarding homes, all the apartments, all the rental houses, the shotgun houses. There's so many other businesses and homes that were part of this, because about 11,000 people are living in Greenwood at this time in 1921, when this all happened. So to try to get our arms around the magnitude of this loss, though, I'm giving you a list of all the businesses that were destroyed that we have a record of. And that includes 34 restaurants and 41 grocery stores, hospitals, doctors' offices. So, what I don't think a lot of people realize is that this attack on Greenwood, it really touched every part of society, from children to the elderly, um, the more affluent to the poorer classes, men, women, every person, every part of this community was touched by this. And to give you an example, the Jackson Undertaking Company, ran by Samuel M. Jackson and Eunice Jackson at the time, they lost not just their business, but a fleet of um, vehicles, an ambulance that they had just purchased to um, help chauffeur grieving families. They lost a line of new caskets. They lost their rental properties that they were renting out, that were bringing in about $300 a month for them as a family. So by the end of June 1st, 1921, all they had to their name was their family car, because they were living at the funeral home as well. So the level of loss can be incredibly compounded for those that are using their home as their business, or their business as their home. And especially if you look on this list, one thing you don't see are banks, because there were no banks in Greenwood at this time. Even though it's known as Black Wall Street, there were actually no banks in Greenwood at this time. So the people who lost their homes, they're often losing, their life savings tucked under mattresses, or tucked in home safes, or deposit boxes that were broken into. So there's levels of loss that are happening here that isn't captured. And what most people, and I should say, the people who are aware of Greenwood to begin with, when I say most people, but for those who know about Black Wall Street, who know about Greenwood, rarely do they know a lot about the history of Greenwood before the Tulsa Race Massacre and what that looks like. I think for a lot of us, the idea of Greenwood as this mecca of Black wealth, where everyone is wealthy, everyone's in sprawling mansions, they're driving fancy cars, it's this epitome of Black wealth. And I love that narrative, but it's not really capturing the whole story. And I think a lot of people, especially Black people, we gravitate to that narrative of this prosperous community that once existed, that is no longer, but is like its own Wakanda in the middle of Oklahoma. And while it's true that people did own mansions, three-story homes and such, and fancy cars, that doesn't mean everyone lived like that. There were all different levels of socioeconomic status in Greenwood, just like everywhere else. The one thing that stood out, though, is that the color of your skin didn't limit your capacity to become a millionaire. And that was a rare thing in the Jim Crow South, because we're talking about the early 1900s. So it definitely would have been a rarity, but not uncommon, especially for Oklahoma. This would have been one of many all Black towns in Oklahoma, as I'm sure many of you know. But on the other side of that, there are people like Emma Buckner, who's in this picture, who is another woman who is an entrepreneur, who she owns her own business, and she's in this dress shop. She's a seamstress. She has her own dress shop. She's made every dress that you see in this photo, and this photo was taken before 1921. So everything that was in the picture, all the dresses, I mean, she lost everything. But it speaks to the fact that you have both men and women owning businesses in Greenwood, and you have the capacity to really make something of yourself here that you might not have been able to in other spaces. But it doesn't mean that everyone is wealthy. Some people are hustling and making a living, like Emma, but there's so much freedom here in being able to own something and create something for yourself as a Black woman that we don't often see in the early 1900s, especially in the South. Now, what people know even less about is what happened in Greenwood after 1921. And this is intentional because most of the media coverage about this has kind of really left the public with this idea that Greenwood was destroyed in 1921, and that's the end of the story. Nothing else happened after that. The city just stayed ashes, and that's not the case. And what I love talking about is all the things that happen after, all the rebuilding efforts that happen after, and how the community came together to rebuild itself. And I do mention that intentionally because the city did nothing to help rebuild Greenwood. The Greenwood residents pulled together and rebuilt it themselves. And so, to give you an example of what this looks like, it happened in stages. So, in the hours after the Tulsa Race Massacre happened, you have thousands of people being rounded up, and uh, and then they're taken to, as Reverend Augustus Hicks mentioned in his testimony, they're taken to different parts of the city, and they're detained in detention camps. And in these detention camps, they are forced to really clean up what has been the remnants of the attack on them as victims, which is insane. But that was part of what happened in the aftermath. So martial law is declared. People are rounded up. They're taken to the ballpark. They're taken to the convention hall. They're taken to all parts of the city. And while they are trying to rebuild their lives, put their lives back together piece by piece, they are living in tents, often through the winter of 1921. And if you've ever been to Oklahoma during the winter, it gets quite cold. It snows. It is freezing temperatures. Oklahoma has the most extreme weather because we're right in the middle of the country. So it gets all the extreme, all the heat extremes, all the cold extremes. So if you can imagine living in a tent through the winter, it's a horrific thing to even imagine, and that's after you've lost everything. So they start in these tents, and then they eventually move into these wood slant homes. But you kind of have this tent city that was built with the help of the Red Cross, and then in addition to the people that are trying to survive and rebuild their homes, You also have people that are fighting for justice immediately after the massacre happens, such as B.C. Franklin, who's pictured here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but he's here on the right side under the tent, and his fellow attorney, I.H. Spears, is to his left. Their law practice is destroyed, their building is destroyed, but they rescue whatever books they can from the building and they fight a legal case from this tent. And from this tent, they are fighting for insurance claims for families who, lost everything, claims that were being repeatedly denied. And then they were also fighting against the city of Tulsa itself because the city of Tulsa wanted to rezone the entire Greenwood district to be a commercial space to block families from being able to rebuild their homes in that area. But they sued the city and won from this tent. And that's one of the reasons why Greenwood was able to rebuild so quickly and actually rebuild it all. So shout out to some really strong legal defense from a tent. And then another thing that happened is when they did start to rebuild and start to rebuild their businesses, not just their homes, they started to rebuild these multi-use structures. And this this picture up in the top right corner is the Phillips building, and what used to be like standalone structures are now under this multi-use frame where you see a barbershop, a billiards hall, a cafe, shoe shiners all together in one structure, first floor, and then the second floor would be living areas, apartments, or boarding houses. So you have a lot of things happening in the landscape that can actually, as me as an archaeologist, I can see a lot of coalescing of features together that were usually separate before. And now it's like safety in numbers. People are starting to build together and build brick, more fire safe housing and businesses, and they're building together, which is beautiful to actually see in the aftermath. So, if Greenwood was one of the most prosperous black towns in America and it suffered actually repeated attacks to its existence, 1921 was just the first attack. How can we reclaim this landscape in our history? That's the question now. And where do we start? And to think about this, where do we start question, there's lots of ways we can possibly start a restorative justice project, but we have to think about where's going to be the easiest, well, let me not say easiest, the most impactful place for us to start. And that really begins with just listening. So whenever I'm about to start a project, I usually go in just trying to understand what the needs are. What are the lingering questions? Who needs to be at the table? And what kind of questions are still remaining? I mean, when we're talking about Greenwood, we're talking about 1921, 104 years ago now, but also all the things that have happened since then and everything that happened before. There's lots of questions that are still remaining, such as was the attack premeditated or orchestrated by the city? That's still a question. What evidence exists that Greenwood was bombed from the air? A lot of people don't even realize that Tulsa is actually the first city to be bombed from the air. This is 20 years before Pearl Harbor. So technically, Tulsa was the first American city to be bombed from the air, except they're bombed by other Americans. So one of the things we're looking into as archaeologists is in looking at these questions, listening to the community, and trying to figure out, okay, what questions can archaeology actually be suited for to answer? What questions can we as archaeologists come alongside and try to help bring some clarity to? Some of these questions we may never know the answer to, like how many people were killed, how many people are possibly buried in mass graves. I mean, we've found one mass grave so far, but there could be many more out there, and we may never know all the ancestors that were taken from us that day. But the question of does any part of historic Greenwood survive today? That's a question that's well suited for archaeology to answer. as well as that question of what happened in the aftermath. How did survivors recover? What was that rebuilding process like? And is there any connection between the challenges today that we're facing and the things that have happened in the past? Creating that timeline and continuum and trying to connect the dots between the past and present, that's definitely something that archaeology is well suited for. I'm gonna get a drink of water. So, what should be the next steps? We've done a community listening session, we've come together, we've tried to create a list of questions, and now we need to think about, what do we do if we have nothing left behind? And I'm putting nothing in quotations because, spoiler alert, there's never nothing left behind, especially when you're an archaeologist. But what do we do when we have nothing left behind? That could mean you have no standing structures left in this community. You may have no current residents or no persons with living memory of that space. Maybe everyone has moved away, or the town is abandoned, or any number of things happen as time passes. For us in Greenwood, we are down to our last two survivors of the original survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre. So it's now really up to the next generation to carry on this history, as our last original storytellers are transitioning. And you may be in a community where there are no archival records left, or maybe those records were burned or taken. In St. Croix, where I do a lot of my work, I'm giving you a picture of the WIM Landmarks Museum, where there's still a lot of damage from previous hurricanes that have affected the status of these archival records. And even before that, these records were under threat because a lot of them were actually taken to Denmark, as the colonial occupiers of the islands. They took a lot of the archives to Denmark away from the island. So you have a lot of records that were taken, a lot of records that were only transcribed in Danish, and then a lot of records that have now seen damage by the result of natural disasters. So there's so many ways that an archive can be lost. An archive can be no longer accessible. So if that's one thing that you don't have, and maybe you have a black town that's been abandoned or developed over, turned into a lake, Oscarville, or any number of things that could have happened to this community. And when we're talking about black towns, the it really runs a spectrum of all the things that have happened to our black towns, and what may seem as a lost cause, a lost case, when we're talking about a black town that's been abandoned or developed over. But there are things we can use outside of these elements for remembrance work. We just have to look a bit deeper into this nothing label. And so for me, of course, I'm going to mention archaeology, the need to look below the surface, because while we see nothing above the surface, there may be quite a lot that's hiding underneath. And that quite a lot could be, even if there's no standing structures, there could be foundations, partial walls, basements that are remaining intact. So in Greenwood, one of those basements in the Vernon AME Church was one of the last things that was still standing after the Tulsa Race Massacre in that area. So it's things like that that can remain intact, that can be part of the storytelling from nothing, even though above the surface it seems like nothing's happening. But also trees and soil. Trees as living witnesses. This is something that I'm looking into with the Black Heritage Tree Project, and how trees can tell stories themselves as living witnesses of the past. But they are also, they're living. They're living archives, really. So even though they are seen as inanimate objects, they're often overlooked because it's just a tree, right? I have seen how these trees become storytellers because the community is activated around them. They become central spaces where people are gathering and where events are happening in communities that they take on a whole different purpose. So talking about Black heritage trees and soil is also really important. I don't know if any of you have been to the Montgomery Legacy Museum, but the soil jars there honoring those lynching victims are part of a larger story that we don't know where these people are possibly buried or what happened to them and their bodies, but we can use soil taken in the sites where their lives were taken as remembrance work. And that soil takes on a whole different purpose at that time. So, trees and soil crying out is definitely part of the work of telling stories from nothing, but also countermapping. So, for a lot of these Black towns that are no longer part of the living landscape, we can virtually or digitally put them back on the map. And we can create these maps that are counter maps showing where things used to be, where things that are important to us reside. And that includes ancient, well, not ancient, but historical routes, or where villages used to be, or where Black towns used to be, even if they're no longer still part of that landscape today. We can create a space where they still exist. And I love counter mapping hidden landscapes because it kind of pushes back against that erasure to say that no, we know where these things are, and we know exactly how to tell these stories and put them back on the map, even if you don't recognize them as such. But there's also the work of gathering the scattered or lost archives, because oftentimes, even if an archive has been scattered, burned, taken, destroyed, there's there's remnants left behind. But sometimes it takes efforts to um, re- regather those elements or reclaim those elements. Depends on what they are and what those records are. But sometimes the gathering of that scattered information can be really valuable. So that begs the question: where are all the Greenwood archives? All the archives related to Greenwood, Tulsa, uh, Black Wall Street. Where are the archives? And I thought this would be a very simple question whenever I first started this work, but it was not. I found out that in all of the collections related to Tulsa, related to Greenwood, related to the Tulsa Race Massacre or Black Wall Street itself, there were over 34 collections that we found. Most of those were outside of Tulsa or outside of the state of Oklahoma, even. So there's still quite a bit of challenge here of one, knowing where to go to get access to your own history, and two, there are certain things behind paywalls. Like if you're not affiliated with Duke University or Brown or Yale, you might have limited access to those materials because it's owned by that institution. So if you go to our website, mappinggreenwood.com, we actually created a resource to try to combat this. We called it the Greenwood Centennial Resource Collection, or the GCRC. And this is a map of where all the collections are that we found. And this is an interactive map. So if you go to our website and you use the / Greenwood Centennial Resource Collection, you'll find this map. And it is interactive. So you can click on any of these book icons and it'll show you what that collection is, what's held in that collection, like what is actually being stored in that collection related to Greenwood, and the state of it. Is it digitized? Is it not? Is it publicly accessible? Is it only for people with that institutional affiliation? So there's still this barrier of access that we still have to tackle here for sure. But the first step of just knowing where things are, knowing where these things exist, was a major step forward for us. Because before this, we didn't have any sort of map or feature that would tell us where all these things are in the world related to our history. And the other thing we built is the Tulsa syllabus. So if you heard of the hashtag Tulsa syllabus, myself and Dr. Carla Slocum at UNC Chapel Hill created this online syllabus really in the wake of Ferguson and Charleston, but also in Tulsa, we had our own issues with violence, but also uh, Trump coming to town right in the wake of that violence and hosting a rally. And there was a lot of unrest in our city that we released this actually on Juneteenth in 2020. And that was a major moment for us to really try to put out some resources for people who had a lot of questions on, why would Tulsa be going through all this right now? Where does this, what's the context around this history? And I know I was getting slammed by inquiries during the 2020 and 2021, or during the centennial year of the Tulsa Race Massacre, from people asking so many questions about, you know, people that are really just finding out that the Tulsa Race Massacre was a thing, and then reaching out to me with questions about, where this all came from. So we created this syllabus to try to really share with the world more about Tulsa's history and Greenwood's history, the rise, the destruction, the rebuilding, but also the context of racial um, relations in Oklahoma as a context to try to understand really the history of the Black experience in Oklahoma more broadly, to give people more of an understanding as to where all these things kind of emerged from. Because it wasn't just one day people just up and decided to try to burn down a town, but this is an ongoing history of, you know, challenges of racial violence over the course of 100 years. But the other thing that we found in the archives was actually something a bit more personal to me. If you see this name here that's highlighted in yellow, Robert Ware, this is my great great uncle, and he is 12 years old at the time in 1920 when this census was taken. He's living on North Hartford Street in Greenwood, and he's attending Dunbar Grade School. Now, he is a survivor, and the reason I know he's a survivor is because after 1920, from that census page, I see him again in the 1940s, and this time he is being drafted into World War II. Now, in this draft card for World War II, he is listed under obvious physical characteristics that will aid in identification. He's listed as having both of his hands burned. Now, how both of his hands are burned is still a question that we have as a family. But my grandmother believes that in the course of trying to save uh, Austin Curtis and Polly Curtis, who he was living with at the time, as his grandparents, possibly in the course of trying to save them, both of his hands are burned in the process. But we don't know exactly what happened. And this could have been, any number of things that caused both of his hands to be burned. So much so that they actually mark it as an identifying characteristic for him in war before he even goes off to war. So there's that. So in the process of doing all of this work, I actually found family members that I didn't know existed. And I'm definitely grateful for that, but I did not anticipate this at all. Because uh, before 2020, if you had asked me if I had any family related to the Tulsa Race Massacre, I would have told you no, because my understanding was we had no family here before my mother and father were here in Oklahoma. So this was eye-opening for me and completely changed the trajectory of my career, really, in learning that there was some personal connection here that I didn't even know existed. So, how can archaeology now be used as a tool for social justice? If we have archives, or even if we don't have archives, what can we do with the archaeology? And there's two projects kind of happening concurrently in Greenwood, and really, really three now that we have the Black Heritage Tree Project. But the two main ones are the Mapping Historical Trauma in Tulsa from 1921 to 2021 project, and the City of Tulsa Search for Mass Graves. And I'm sure you've heard all about the search for mass graves. This has been in the news for years. And we did successfully find, one mass grave, but as I mentioned, that could be one of many. I think a lot of the media has gotten hung up on this idea of we found the mass grave as if that is the only one and that is the end of our work. But this is an ongoing process, and they're actually restarting this week with another round of surveys. So, between the two, one is more of a restorative justice project, and one is more of a retributive justice project. Our work, my work as an archaeologist, has been primarily with the Mapping Historical Trauma project to try to find the remnants of the built environment of Greenwood, the things that we have built, the things that we have left behind, and looking for those signs of structural survival in Greenwood. The City Search for Mass Graves is more of a retributive justice project because they are treating this as a homicide investigation. It's a 100-year-old homicide investigation, but still, that is the process in which they have taken that work to try to approach it like you would a homicide investigation. And I should say, between these two projects, you know, the first one is, more academic leaning. It's just me and my colleague, Parker Van Valkenburg, who, as two Tulsa homegrown archaeologists have come together to create a project with some students. The City Search for Mass Graves is a much larger initiative, much different level of funding, many different team members. And I think it's like 56 people that are part of that work across three different committees. So there's way more going on with the Search for Mass Graves than with our MHTT project. So that's the archaeology. But how do we fit maps into restorative justice work? Now, what I love about maps is that whenever you have maps, and especially counter maps, you can layer them together and create a whole different image. The image I'm showing you now, it seems confusing, but you're basically seeing the overlay of two of the same sections of Greenwood at different times. The base layer is a satellite map, an aerial imagery of Tulsa as it looks today, with the baseball field, the highway going through it, the parking lot from Oklahoma State University, and the Greenwood Cultural Center. And you see the overlay on top of that is a historical map. This is a what they call a Sanborn Fire Insurance map. And this is dating back to, I believe it's the 1937 map. But this one is overlaid on top of what you would see today. So if you go to Greenwood today, you'll see that highway running through the middle of Greenwood. You'll see the ballpark. You'll see all these things that, weren't there before. But whenever you can layer another map on top of that and show what used to be here, it makes it a lot clearer as to the levels of destruction, but also change that's happened over time here. And that the streets themselves have been removed, some of them. You have a lot of different structures and businesses and homes that have been completely, erased from the landscape now. But when you create these different counter maps, you can digitally put them back on the map, digitally create space where we showcase what used to be here. So one thing you can show through maps is how this story has been changing through time, but also the disruption, the shifting of this footprint of the district. And especially in Greenwood, when the districts have been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, there's been a lot of encroachment and gentrification and land erasure and land theft. But as the footprint is shrinking, we've also seen how it can bounce back. So there's been periods actually of destruction, but also growth in Greenwood throughout its 100-year journey. So showing that through maps can be really empowering to see that it's not just that our neighborhood is gone or our district is gone, but it's been going through these cycles of reverberating patterns here. But this can also be a space where we can reimagine and really redraw the historical boundaries of this district. Because as I said, the footprint today is a lot smaller, but we can actually reimagine that, reclaim some space, redraw what these boundaries used to look like, and create spaces digitally that we don't see in our landscape today. But we can also bear witness to the environmental racism, this highway going through it, the neighborhood erasure that's happened, and bear witness to all of that through the maps. And this really adds another layer of testimony. So whenever people are talking about the things that have happened in Greenwood, this adds another layer of evidence to the story. That's a bit harder to dismiss, which I love. And but it can also show cycles of resilience through time. So to give you an example of that, for most people, the fixation again is on the attack in 921, what I call the first attack on Greenwood. But there are so many different phases to this history. We got the rise of Greenwood that's happening around 1900 to 1920. And I put a little leaf next to these periods of growth. So you have a definite period of growth in that 1900, early 1900 to 1920 era. And then this massive attack in 1921. But then you have this period of survival and recovery where things are growing again. And actually, once you get to the revival stage in the 1930s to 1950s, in that 1940 era, Greenwood is actually twice the size of what it was in 1921 after they rebuilt. But a lot of people don't see the full cycles of this history because we're so hyper focused on only 1921 that we kind of miss the survival and recovery and rebuilding stages that happened after. And even the second war on Greenwood, that was mainly by eminent domain and urban renewal, all the different things that happened in the 1960s and 70s that led to really a second attack on Greenwood as they decided to put a highway going directly through the community. But now we're in this new era where we see a lot of rebuilding and reimagining and new businesses coming in. That even though there's still a lot of gentrification happening, I'm also seeing a rise in Black businesses again. So this is a whole other phase that we're in, and there'll continue to be more phases in the future. So these cycles of history are going to keep, progressing forward. But I think we're in a whole different space now to where we might be coming up to see another leaf coming up soon as more growth is happening in Greenwood. So to give you an example of how these maps can work to reclaim space and kind of reframe the narrative, I love highlighting something called critical sites of memory. And what these are spaces where they really serve as anchors in the storytelling. So whenever you have people telling stories about Greenwood, depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different story and a whole different perspective. But one thing that critical sites of memory can do, they can anchor the story in place and time, no matter who the storyteller is. So to give you an example, there's a specific place in Greenwood known as Standpipe Hill. And this is an actual hill space. And this is where the most affluent members of Greenwood were living at the time. And why this serves as a critical site of memory is that this is a fixed point in the landscape, which everyone kind of recognized. And this is literally the highest point in Greenwood. So one thing that people now know about Greenwood, and this is a lot from the oral histories, is that this is a site of violence. In 1921, Standpipe Hill was one of the spaces that the Oklahoma National Guard purged machine guns on top of the hill. This is also where they are potentially launching airplanes to drop bombs on the community. So there's a lot of stories of violence from this hill space. But the other side of that is that this is also a space where there was a school. So this is part of the educational legacy in Greenwood as well. So is it a site of violence, or is it an educational legacy space, or is it both? There's questions around this. But we didn't have, without these maps, we wouldn't be able to really dive into that history. So to give you an example here, this is a fire insurance map from 1907 that shows the Tulsa Ward School at the base of Standpipe Hill right here. But this map is also showing you some different sides to this whole district, and that whenever the newspapers at the time, really white-owned circulating newspapers at the time, described the Negro district, the Greenwood district, as a problem, that needed to be solved, as this space where you have a lot of juke joints and pool halls and drinking that needed to be eradicated because we're in the age of prohibition. So, if the newspapers are all trying to paint Greenwood to be one way, when we look at these historic maps, and especially like these Sanborn Fire Insurance maps, we can see, yeah, there are definitely pool hall juke joints, but there are also churches, there are also hotels, single family dwellings. There are also, this is literally labeled Negro shanties on this map, but you can guess what these are. These are shotgun houses. So between all of this, you've got the life of a full neighborhood. You've got these grand hotels, but you also have these Negro shanties. So you see the many different sides of, socioeconomic standing here. And with the schools and churches, you also have the pool halls and juke joints. So it's not, one or the other. It's all of it. That yes, you do see the party spaces, but you also have, churches and schools and hospitals and all these other things that make up a neighborhood, even though they're trying to paint it to be one way. When you look at it on the map, you can actually see these critical sites that tell a fuller story of this community beyond what they were trying to paint it to be. And how we are redrawing the boundaries of this district. I mean, if you're looking at this image on the left, oh, sorry, the image on the right here show you this one little block, this little triangle down here that serve as the boundaries of the historic Greenwood Business District today. But the Greenwood district itself is much larger footprint, but would have been even larger if we could actually go back in time, take back the map to 1911. You go from this one block radius to at least 42 blocks that are listed as being part of the Negro district and bounded by the highways, these railways. And those railways are still there today. So, how we are marking space and how we can actually see space being utilized by Black people in this district from 1911 until now, there's been a lot of change, a lot of shifting, where we can actually go back and redraw those boundaries and actually show how that footprint has been changing and shifting and growing through time through these maps. So to give you an example of that, one thing I love about how these maps can actually show more of the story is that whenever you are to most of the timelines that have been produced around, all the events in the Tulsa Race Massacre, they show these timelines as like linear events, as if the things happened in an orderly fashion, one after another. But in all actuality, what was actually happening during 1921 was chaos. So you have a lot of things happening all over the city at the same time. And it's more of an accurate representation whenever you can portray all of that happening on a map around the city at the same time instead of presenting a linear timeline of events. So, to give you an example, we know that there's an initial interaction that happens in the Drexel building on the elevator between Sarah Page and Dick Rowland. Dick Rowland is the young Black man, and really, I'll say, young Black teenage boy who is a shoe shiner at the time. And Sarah Page is a white female elevator operator who's also young. She screams. We don't exactly know why she screamed, but the accusation is there, and that puts Dick Rowland on the run for his life. And then he's imprisoned. Literally the next day, he's caught and imprisoned and then taken to the courthouse. The courthouse is very close by to the Drexel building. And this is all in downtown Tulsa. Very close to that time when he's arrested and put in the courthouse, we hear break-ins into the armory. And white people are breaking into the armory to arm themselves and take out ammunitions, take out weapons, whatever they can to prepare to break into the courthouse and enact their own form of justice against Dick Rowland. Now, all this is happening downtown, but to the north on Greenwood is where, so you have to actually flip this map over to see where the northern side of Greenwood is, where all the, not all, but most of the Black families are living. And people start to, white people are gathering around the courthouse to the tune of like 500 people are gathered around the courthouse steps, preparing to lynch Dick Rowland. And people in northern Greenwood are hearing all of this going down, and they run to his defense. And by they, predominantly World War I veterans, black men who served in World War I, are now coming to his defense. And then First Street becomes this first battle line, like the last line of defense before this angry white mob break into not only the courthouse but invade Greenwood, because that's their next mission, is to invade Greenwood and burn it to the ground. So First Street becomes this battle line. Now when we flip the map over, we're now in Greenwood on the northern side of town. We've passed those railroad tracks I mentioned. There's so much happening at the exact same time. You've got people who are still watching a movie in the Dreamland Theater, in the Dixie Theater, and they are watching a movie up until like 10 o'clock at night, especially in the Dixie Theater. Mr. Cotton runs in and turns on the house lights and tells everyone to go home because they're shooting. There are people who are stranded on this train at the Katy Railway Station. This train goes to, I believe, Muskogee or Okmulgee. And whenever they are stranded on this train, they're stranded from 10 o'clock to like 6:45 the next morning, stuck on this train, hearing gunshots, hearing bombs, and we don't know enough about their story. But this is all happening around the same time all over the city. And you can't even really capture the chaos with this linear timeline that we're used to seeing, but you can do it with a map. So, what about the trees? What can trees do to aid in restorative justice and reclaiming Black spaces? So I'm definitely going to highlight the Black Heritage Tree Project because this is our newest grant project with National Geographic Society, funded through a Meridian grant. We just started March 1st, but this gives us a way to tell stories about Black communities and to give Black communities more tools at their disposal, even if they have no archives, no structures, no artifacts, uh, if there's no people with living memory, if all they have left are trees, there's still a way to reclaim space and tell your story. So with the Black Heritage Tree Project, our mission is to actually, it's a storytelling initiative to bring together narratives of survival and Black freedom through the canopy, through the trees that have been witnessing these moments of Black freedom, moments of erasure and violence, but also moments of joyous celebration and everything in between. So we're collecting those stories, we're mapping out these trees, but we're also creating a database of tree stories at the same time. And to give you an example of one, this is the Freedom Tree in Missouri City, Texas. This is a tree standing on what used to be the Palmer Plantation. And during Juneteenth, 1865, the General Order number 3 was read and had to be enforced, with Union soldiers going plantation to plantation to enforce this order of freedom. And this is one of those plantations where they stopped, read the order, and enforced that freedom be enacted. And it was under this very tree that General Order number 3 was read, for everyone at the Palmer Plantation. And that tree is still standing. So people every year, especially on Juneteenth, they come under this tree to gather and listen to the order again and imagine what their ancestors felt the moment they heard they were free under this very spot, under this tree. And that tree is, like I said, it's still there and it's a historical landmark in itself. So, excuse me, it's one of those ways that we can actually use our connection to the natural landscape, our connection to the trees and to the soil, as a way to tell stories about Black freedom that we couldn't tell, just from a book or just from a document in an archive. But it gives you a way to actually touch history and touch something that was connected to your ancestors. And here's another example. This is in Tulsa. This is what's now known as the Greenwood Legacy Tree. It used to be called the Massacre Tree, but we have renamed it because it is at least 120 years old, and it's an American elm tree that now we've discovered predates the Tulsa Race Massacre. And it's still standing today. It's leaning, but it's still standing today. So we are renaming it to honor that this tree has seen a lot more than just what happened in 1921. It's seen the entire history of Greenwood, the founding of Greenwood, the birth of Greenwood, the rise and the fall and the rebuilding and everything in between of Greenwood. So we've now named it the Greenwood Legacy Tree to honor that. And we've also done some testing around it. We prayed over it. We tied a ribbon around it. But we also offered soil and water to acknowledge that, this tree is under our stewardship now. And it's one of the many trees that we see as an ancestral storyteller that we're trying to keep an eye on and extend its life. So we've talked about archives, we talked about maps, we talked about the archaeology, we've talked about trees. But what does it actually look like when you pull it all together? And I'm going to give you an example. We're going back to Standpipe Hill, that hill that I mentioned in Greenwood. And so for this hill, it currently is bisected by a highway, and specifically an on-ramp to the highway. So it used to be one whole hill space with a giant water tower on it. But now it's this bisected hill, two hills rather, with a on-ramp to the highway in between. So originally, we can go back to the original boundaries. You're going to see this giant hill with a water tower on it, where you see the school over to the western edge and a lot of other homes and churches, actually. But it's now been a bit segmented and disrupted with all the roads and everything. So the question is this a site of violence, a site of Black wealth? Because I mentioned that this is where, machine guns were purchased. There's a lot of violence connected to this space. But this is also where the most affluent members of Greenwood were living. So you have really the largest homes in Greenwood on top of this hill. So this is an elevated Black space. But today, if you ask people in Tulsa if Standpipe Hill is part of historic Greenwood, a lot of them would actually say no, because this is considered to be part of downtown, considered to be, part of OSU Tulsa's campus. So there's this idea that this is a white-owned extension of downtown. It's kind of been separated, disassociated from its Black foundations, but we're working to change that. So one thing that, and this is actually why we started with Standpipe Hill, is because there's been so much contention around this space, and really this need to really problematize this idea that this is just, downtown, this isn't Greenwood. So if we can actually use archaeology, use all of these tools together to reclaim this space, we could do it anywhere. So we took this space and made note of all the ways that we saw it coming up in the archives. We saw at least 30 residences, affluent homes on top of the hill. We noted that the Tulsa Ward School was there. This is a consistent landmark in Greenwood, and this is also where the first iteration of Paradise Baptist Church stood on the north side. But this serves as a critical western boundary marker for Greenwood, because if we can actually push out that western marker of Greenwood over past Standpipe Hill, that really changes the entire map of what historic Greenwood is, and really takes some land away from downtown, which I love. So in June 2021, we came together and did a survey with a lovely group of students, and they were all volunteers at this time. This is before we had the Net Geo money. So we were all volunteers together in the hot sun in Oklahoma on top of this very steep hill. My heart goes out to every one of these students who were kind enough and brave enough to work with us through this. But we did GPS mapping, pedestrian survey, some drone imagery, tree research, all together to try to understand more about this space. So we ended up finding 155 artifacts, and that's just on the surface finds. We didn't do any digging on Standpipe Hill, and 25 structural features. And this is what our transects look like. So every one of these lines, picture a student and myself. We're all walking in these straight lines up and down all through this hill. And it's hot, but they did their best to literally traverse over this entire area and look for artifacts on the surface. Now, what we found was that there's a lot of artifacts that were sitting on the surface of this hill, even though we were told we would not find anything because this is a heavily terraced and heavily manicured area. So everything that would have been there from 1921 is definitely going to be gone. So y'all shouldn't even bother looking, is what they told us. But we did it anyway, and we ended up finding quite a bit of things. So what's interesting is that whenever we are overlaying our artifact finds, all these green dots are artifact finds with their own field specimen number. FS stands for field specimen number. But they were given their own coordinates, their own sort of point on the map, so we can map them out like this. And then we created what's called a heat map or an artifact density map to show us where's the greatest concentration of artifacts found on this site. And it all pointed to this northwest corner here. That deepest blue is where you see the heaviest concentration of artifacts being uncovered. And so when we actually overlaid our heat map with the Sanborn fire insurance maps that show where all the buildings are, we found a pattern. And that the most artifacts, that concentration in this northwest corner here, is also in line with what used to be historic structures. So this got us really excited. But what was even more interesting is that that same northwest corner where these buildings are is also where you have a grove of trees. And these trees are growing in a square shape around one of these structures that no one else can see above the surface. It's one of those areas where it looks like there's nothing there, but there's actually quite a bit happening below the surface. So these trees are literally holding a structure in place that no one else can see. And this is where the most artifacts are being concentrated at the same time. So you can actually kind of see the building eroding out of the side of this hill. The trees, their root bulbs are holding that structure in place, keeping it from eroding out of the side of the hill. But what was really interesting when we looked at these trees, one, the trees growing in a square around a structure like this is not normal. This is not a natural phenomenon that trees do. So we wanted to know more about these trees. Could they have been there in 1921? Could these be witness trees from the Tulsa Race Massacre? And what kind of trees are they? Were they intentionally planted here? And the questions that we had required an arborist, because me as an archaeologist, I'm trained to, look at the ground, look underneath the ground, look for artifacts that are, that are part of this underground world. Rarely do I get a chance to look up, look around, and take account of the trees that are around me. But these trees really made me pay attention to them because one, a lot of the artifacts that we were finding, the trees were actually pushing the artifacts up to the surface for us to find. So most of the artifacts we found were around trees, around where trees were located. As their roots looking for water, they're pushing artifacts up to the surface for us to find. So those trees gave us a whole new context of what this site meant, because these are pretty important trees. We brought an arborist to tell us, one, how old they are, but two, what kind of trees they are, what species of trees are we dealing with. And the first thing I'll say is that these trees are hackberry trees. That's the species type they are, hackberry trees. And so with hackberry trees, they are incredibly resilient trees. If you have any hackberry trees in your backyard, they are incredibly hard to get rid of if you are trying to cut it down. Because whenever there's a forest fire or a canopy clearing, something catastrophic that happens, like say a whole neighborhood is burned down, they are often the first ones to grow back. And whenever they grow back with memory, because bark, like our skin, it holds scars, it heals, it changes, it tells you something about where that tree has been and what it's healed from. And whenever these trees grow back after some kind of fire event has happened. They grow back with a thicker, wartier, discolored bark. And whenever they grow back, the question is, could these trees have been there in 1921? How old are they? And the arborists, from the arborist samples that we took, and we did a bore increment sampling method. It's minimally invasive for these trees. So it's a way for us to tell the age of the tree without ever cutting it down. We don't have to sit down and count rings. And so with that method, we found out that these trees are about 50 to 60 years old. So they could not have been there in 1921. These aren't trees that are, survivor trees from the massacre, but they are the descendants. And what's interesting is that even though they are not old enough to have been there in 1921, to have been part of that witnessing moment, they grew back as if they had. They grew back with a thicker, wartier, discolored bark as a measure of fire protection for themselves, even though they had not witnessed that event themselves. These are the descendant trees. And this was the first time that I could see nature behaving in a way that I saw my community as people behaving, as descendants moving through this history, still being marked by it, still carrying it, but none of us were there in 1921. None of us were there to actually witness that history itself. But as the descendants, we're trying to learn from those lessons and move forward with those lessons in our mind and in our hearts. And that's something that I didn't think trees had the capacity to do until I until these trees forced me to pay attention to them and call out to me in this way. So this is really the start to the Black Heritage Tree Project for me, is this moment on Standpipe Hill, connecting with these trees, connecting with the archaeology all together, because I realized that looking underground, I was only getting half the story. I needed to really take advantage of every part of this story, from the archives to the archaeology to the trees, to really get an understanding of what it means to really know the history of Greenwood. So, talking about artifacts that are left behind, there were quite a bit. We found a lot of elements connected to either domestic life or like literally just a neighborhood life, from bottles, glass bottles, to children's toys. We have marbles, we have all these different things. But we also looked for any evidence of burning, because again, we're looking for evidence of fire. And so this twisted, melted amalgamation of glass is one of the things we're looking for, actually, as we're trying to track the elements of things being burned and from this assemblage in Greenwood. But we also found, children's toys, evidence of children at play, because this is part of a neighborhood. Children are leaving things behind just like the adults, but they're often the ones that are most overlooked in the full storytelling. Often children are the least talked about when we're talking about the things that people leave behind on this earth. In terms of historical sites, rarely do you hear about kids at the historical sites, but those are the things that I look for as a parent, as a mom. And we're also looking for evidence of violence, though, because this is part of the story of this neighborhood. And unfortunately, we did find quite a few elements that connect to either bullet fragments or shotgun shells or casings that all connect to this history. So what was the most unsettling for me was actually that we found these children's toys next to these shell casings, next to barbed wire, next to knife fragments, next to all these other things that speak to the the fact that this neighborhood that has lots of children, lots of families, lots of businesses, also witnessed horrific violence, and you can actually see it in the archaeological record. And the other thing that was really interesting that we found were actually bricks. Bricks sound like really boring artifacts, but when you're talking about Greenwood, what's really interesting is that the oral histories told us that in the aftermath of the Tulsa Race Massacre, people were being blocked from getting access to brick and lumber locally. So they were being forced to get brick and lumber from wherever they could get it. That was the oral history. And that was something that was dismissed for a long time as just a conspiracy theory, as people just exaggerating. And that really didn't happen. But the artifacts themselves can tell us a lot more, because the bricks that we were finding, we found some stamped Fulton, Missouri, St. Louis, Coffeyville, Kansas. They're getting bricks from wherever they can. And we can actually see it in the archaeological record. We can actually see the bricks stamped from all these other places, even though the site where we're working in, the Acme brick plant was across the street. So it literally only makes sense for it to have played out exactly how they said it did, for the artifacts to show up that way. And then there were things that we just left in situ, that we left in place, like these red bird feathers, because red birds in Greenwood have a whole different connotation, a spiritual connection to ancestors. That if you see a red bird, it means that you are right where you need to be in that moment, and it means there's an ancestor looking over you as you're doing that work wherever you are. So we saw a lot of red birds while we were doing our work, and that definitely brought me some comfort. But those feathers are something we just, left at the site. It's not like something we collected as an artifact. And then there are things like this penny here. Now, pennies, again, they seem innocuous. They seem like something that you just throw around. They don't mean anything. It's just a penny. But the fact that this penny was dated back to 1912, this penny tells us a whole different story about what's possible here. Because again, we were told we would not find anything that predated 1921, because everything was destroyed in 1921. So you're not going to find anything that predates that. So finding a penny in one of our excavation units, one of our shovel tests that actually dates back to 1912, was a a crazy discovery that we didn't even think we would find. But here we are, that we can actually find things that prove, that support the idea that there is structural survival in Greenwood, that the destruction of 921 was not so complete that nothing survived. That has now been, that we've kind of shut down that myth that nothing had survived. There's so much now that has really spoken out and really screamed out that we're still here, that we've always been here, that there's there are things that existed before 1921 that still linger in this landscape. We just have to look a bit harder for it. So to pull all this together, Standpipe Hill as is still there, and it's still this large hill, even though it's been segmented and kind of disrupted. But now we can tell so much more about the history of Standpipe Hill after doing this work, through the maps, through the artifacts, through the trees, through everything left behind. We can say that this site is, yes, a site of racial violence, but also it's a sacred space, a site of religious observance. It's a site of affluence. It's a site of education. It's a site of retreat and safety. We have a lot of oral histories that talk about, in the aftermath of the massacre, that people ran to this hill to try to look for their loved ones, to try to get a vantage point, a higher ground, to look for their loved ones, to locate family members. So this is a space of retreat as well. And this is a site of remembrance now because of our work, because of the Equal Justice Initiative. EJI actually came to collect soil for one of those soil jars at the museum. There are soils from Standpipe Hill specifically that was collected to be part of that collection. There's so many ways that this has turned into a site of remembrance now. There's a historical marker there now, and there's a lot more information that we've learned through this process just by expanding the tools that we're using to tell the story. And to give you an example here, I mean, typically these are the tools that we are used to using for social justice, for Black studies. We have the oral histories, the archives, the genealogical records, ethnographies, historical photos. But when you can pair the archaeology methods and expand the capacity, expand that toolbox out, the possibilities are endless, because that's when you could add the maps, the historical structures, the markers, the monuments, the artifacts, the building footprints I mentioned, the soil samples, the burial grounds, both the analysis and the reburial of ancestral remains, the sacred landscapes, the Black heritage trees. There's so many things that we can use in our toolbox now that we can take advantage of and really expand our capacity for reclaiming space and reclaiming our heritage. So, to give you an idea of what other social justice projects are going on in Tulsa right now, we've got a Pathway to Hope and another nomination for historic significance on the National Register. We're trying to get the National Register designation at the district level. Right now, we have certain buildings and then a 100 block of Greenwood that's been listed, but we're trying to get it at the district level. Changing street names. There's been quite a few names of streets that have been named after Klan members in Tulsa because the Klan was running Tulsa. And for some people, it still is run by the Klan. But, we have some names that have changed now, and new historical markers that have gone up, new national monument. There's a movement actually to designate Greenwood as a national monument. So I think that's been approved now. So I'm not sure when that's going to go into place, but that's another thing that's going to be happening soon. And then some new education initiatives, some new curricula that's been developed. We have Black History Saturdays, founded by Christy Williams. Every one Saturday a month, they get together and teach Black history. And I'm one of the instructors for that. So I'm so happy to have that program because currently Black history has been banned from a lot of our schools. So if we want to have our children know their history, we have to teach it ourselves and teach it in an informal learning space outside of a public school setting. So that it's sad that we have to do that, but I'm thankful that that program exists in Tulsa. There's also some genealogy research training going on, especially for descendants in Greenwood to become certified descendants. And then there's new museums opening up, but also if you've heard about Mayor Nichols' historic reparations plan, $105 million that have been proposed. This is still an ongoing development, but that was just announced, I believe in May, the end of May or early June, that was announced. So this is still something that we are working through, but this is the largest reparations plan in history. And the fact that it's been passed by or been proposed by Tulsa's first Black mayor is historic on so many levels. So we've seen the legal case for reparations kind of close and sunset after our last denial, but there's new hope on the horizon with this reparations plan for Tulsa. So the other thing that we built, I mentioned some new curriculum. This is one of them, the Greenwood Archaeology Curriculum. We launched this back on May 2024 with the Mapping Historical Trauma Project. So this is on the mappinggreenwood.com website. It's designed for 11th and 12th graders. It's a free archaeology-based online curriculum created in partnership with Archaeology in the Community. And we used a lot of primary resources because this is the only way we can kind of get around some of these bans and laws is leading with the primary resources. So there's definitely the inclusion of stories from survivors and descendants and modern residents in Greenwood, but it's designed to align with Common Core state standards for social studies 9th through 12th and ELA 11th and 12th, but definitely driven by trauma-informed, culturally relevant teaching. And for me personally, I love highlighting multiple learning styles. So it has a lot of activities in there for our kinesthetic learners, for people who like to listen or watch a film and can better learn and process information that way. There's lots of ways people engage with this curriculum, and it's online for free. You can download it right now. And then the other thing that we built is actually a syllabus. This is with the Black Heritage Tree Project. We just launched this one back on August 15th, 2025. So this is our newest education resource that we put out. But this syllabus has over 100 books on it. You can download the syllabus on our website, blackheritagetrees.com/syllabus. But you can also utilize the interactive tool on our webpage. So you can search by children's versus adult resources, or organized by area. So if you're looking into books or readings in the Tulsa area, or Houston or Galveston or St. Croix, it's organized by site, and then or also organized by media type. So if you're looking for a book or an article or a video or a podcast, that you can organize it by that way as well. So where should you go if you want to learn more? I would definitely recommend you check out some books, specifically books written by local Black authors in Tulsa, or at least in Oklahoma. I've mentioned a few books like Mary Jones Parrish's book. I don't know if this book is still in print, but I know her granddaughter has put out a new edition of this book that I highly recommend you check out. And then Hannibal Johnson has written several books that I would definitely recommend. And Eddie Faye Gates, who just passed away in 2021, had written two books about this. Definitely recommend Carlos Locum's book, Black Towns, Black Futures. There's so many other books that I would recommend, but definitely highlighting local Black authors in our state. And you can also contact me. You can visit my website. My personal website is archaeologyrewritten.com, but also you can email me, digtorewrite@gmail.com, or check out our projects, Map in Greenwood or the Black Heritage Tree Project. You can follow me on Facebook or Instagram. Check out the YouTube page. Lots of ways to interact. And I would love, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me via email. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can properly say bye to everyone. But thank you so much for having me. Thank you for listening. And I know you all are going to be eating lunch and sharing more about these sessions that are happening throughout the week. And I thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And I hope you have a wonderful time at the Land Justice Convening. See you later.